Good morning. Good morning. Thursday morning, January 12th. A rainy Vancouver Island day. Very gray today. Kind of still dark out. Anyways, today I'm going to continue on for an hour reading Mafia prints inside America's most violent crime family and the bloody fall of Cosa Nostra by Phil Leonetti with Scott Burnstein and Chris Graziano. Let's have a couple tokes, chill out. Legal in Canada, medical too. If anybody ever wants to talk about it, I can talk to you about it. All right, so without further ado, this morning I'm going to carry on with where I left off yesterday. What the future would hold for Bruno and those operating in and around the Philadelphia mob, which now, including rackets in neighboring Atlantic City, would be anything but docile, especially once Nicky Scarfo and his nephew Philip Leonetti gained control. So yeah, young Philip. This is page 24 if you're following along at home. My name is Philip Michael Leonetti, and I was born on March 27th, 1953 in Philadelphia. My father's name was Pascal Leonetti, and my mother's name was Anna Annunziata Scarfo, but everyone called her Nancy. I was born into this life, the Mafia, the Cosa Nostra. It was inevitable for me. It was literally in my blood. Both sides of my family, the Leonettis and Scarfos, had immigrated to the United States from Naples and Calabria, and both families had strong ties to the Mafia in Italy before I was born. My grandfather, Christopher Leonetti, was a mob-connected hood who ran with a crew of guys in Manhattan's Little Italy. In the 20s, he got killed after his crew tried to shake down a couple of guys they thought were low-level greaseballs, ziggies, but turned out to be high-ranking Sicilian gangsters. They ended up whacking him and leaving him in the street. Growing up, my Uncle Nick would tell me, the Sicilians, the Ziggies, they are not like us. They can't be trusted. It's something I would never forget. My father, Pascal Leonetti, was a well-respected gambler who was picked by Angelo Bruno to oversee many of the mob-controlled card and dice games that operated in and around South Philadelphia in the late 50s and early 60s. Angelo Bruno was the boss of the Philadelphia mob. He was the Don. Back then, the mob had games in the back rooms of almost every restaurant, neighborhood bar, corner store, and social club in South Philly. Knock-around street guys from the neighborhood would come and gamble, drink booze, smoke cigars, and escape from their wives or girlfriends for a few hours in these joints, and the mob was making money catering to them. First of all, the mob ran the games, which means they won more than they lost. The house always wins. Second, they were selling booze to the gamblers, which means they were making money on the house, and the gamblers would get drunk and end up gambling more than they should. That's when one of the mob guys who was working that joint would pull the gambler aside and loan him money at a high interest rate so that he could keep drinking and gambling or use the money to pay the rent or the electric bill. If a guy borrowed $10,000 and the loan shark charged him 2 points, he would have to pay $200 a week in interest, which was known as the VIG or the juice, every week, and he still owed the $10,000. So let's say it took him 10 weeks to pay the money back. He'd pay $2,000 in juice money and the $10,000 in principal. So he'd end up paying $12,000 on a $10,000 loan. If it took him a year to pay back, he'd pay over $10,000 in interest and still owe the $10,000 in principal. This is primarily how the mob makes its money even today, illegal gambling and loan sharking. Now, my father had a reputation as a serious gambler, not only in South Philadelphia, but in Jersey and even in New York. He was so well known and respected that Walter Winchell, the famous journalist, wrote a piece on him that this is why Ange picked my father to run those games. He was that good. But when it came to being a father, he was no good. He was a bum. After his luck took a turn for the worse, Pascal went from running the mob's top card games to owing the mob the money he lost and couldn't pay back when he gambled himself. Pascal Leonetti had crapped out. When Philip was just a baby, Pascal left Philadelphia and headed south to Florida, leaving Nancy and young Philip to fend for themselves. Angelo Bruno had taken Pascal's exterminating business as a way of clearing his debts. Philip and his mother were left with nothing. By this time, Nancy's parents, Philip and Catherine Scarfo, had also left South Philadelphia, moving 60 miles east to Atlantic City. The once booming seaside resort known as the World's Playground had fallen on hard times and was considered down and out by the early 60s. It had literally gone from boom to bust. The Scarfos purchased 2 connecting apartment buildings at 2628 North Georgia Avenue in the city's Italian enclave known as Ducktown. Each building stood 4 stories tall and was 2.5 blocks from the world-famous Atlantic City boardwalk and the sandy beaches leading to the Atlantic Ocean, and was surrounded by other similarly structured row homes. Nancy's father, Philip Scarfo, was a laborer who worked at Atlantic City's prestigious Chalfont Haddon Hall Hotel. Wow, that was a mouthful, eh? But I want to just mark that there. My grandfather, Philip Scarfo, was a wonderful man. I was named after him. When I was little and we lived in South Philadelphia, he had a job where he had a horse with a wagon, and he used to give me rides around the neighborhood. He'd also take me crabbing when I was a little boy. He was a hard worker his whole life and was never involved in the mob or anything illegal. He was 100% legit. Nancy's mother, Catherine Scarfo, was a homemaker and a devout Catholic who faithfully attended Mass every morning at St. Michael's Church, which was located less than 50 yards from the Scarfo family home. Yeah, I guess that's fine. I guess I'm off on the side of it, but whatever, that doesn't matter. Phil goes on to say, my grandfather was the typical old-style Italian matriarch, grandmother, sorry. My grandmother was the typical old-school Italian matriarch. All of her grandchildren called her Mum. She went to church every morning, not just Sundays, and her cooking, my God, nobody cooked like her. She was a real character, one of a kind. She was well liked in the neighborhood. If someone had a problem or needed advice, they'd come and see Mum. Her three brothers, Nick, Joe, and Mike Piccolo, were all well-respected soldiers in the Bruno crime family, which was based in Philadelphia but maintained a strong presence in New Jersey, particularly in the cities of Trenton, Newark, and Atlantic City. Each had been adorned with the same nickname. They were known respectively as Nicky, Buck, Joe, Buck, and Mikey Buck, and owned and operated Piccolo's 500, a notorious mob hangout that grew into a popular restaurant and club in South Philadelphia. Mikey Buck Piccolo was Phil Leonetti's godfather. My great uncle Mike used to take me fishing when I was a little boy with my cousin Ronald. He was a nice man, a gentleman. My great uncle Nick Piccolo, Nicky Buck, who was on my mother's side, was married to my grandfather's sister, my aunt Mary, on my father's side. This marriage strengthened the Scarfo-Leonetti bond. Then there was Philip's Uncle Nick. Uncle Nick. Nicodemo Dominic Scarfo was born on March 8, 1929, to Philip and Catherine Scarfo in Brooklyn, New York, in 1941. When Nick was 12 years old, the Scarfo family, which now included younger sister and Annunziata, Nancy, left New York and settled in South Philadelphia, which was by then heavily populated by second-generation Italian families. As a young boy, Scarfo spent his summers working in the sprawling blueberry fields in Hamilton, New Jersey, known as the blueberry capital of the world. Hamilton is a small town located 30 miles east of Philadelphia and 30 miles west of Atlantic City. It sits smack dab in the middle of the 60-mile corridor that connects the two cities with the Atlantic City Expressway. Scarfo had learned firsthand about the tireless life of a laborer, a life that he wanted to no part of as an adult. His big dreams didn't involve picking blueberries for a living. To him, People who worked for a living were jerk-offs, and Nicky Scarfo didn't fancy himself a jerk-off. Scarfo, who would come to be known as Little Nicky for his diminutive size, stood a mere 5 feet 5 inches tall. He was voted most talkative by his classmates at Benjamin Franklin High School, which he graduated from in 1947, and his senior yearbook declared the same year that he was out to lick the world. What Scarfo lacked in height, he made up for in fearlessness. Despite his size, he began to box in his late teens under the name Nick Scarfo and amassed an impressive record in small club fights on the Philadelphia boxing circuit. But as the 1950s came, the bantamweight Scarfo decided that he was better suited for life outside of the ring. Nicky Scarfo wanted to be a gangster. Just like the movie star mobsters he grew up admiring in the shoot-'em-up flicks, he would sneak into the theater to see it as a kid. Guys like Paul Muni in the 1932 gangster classic Scarface, not the top baseball players of the late 1940s like Stan Musial, excuse me, and Ted Williams were Nicky Scarfo's idols. Like the working stiff, athletes were also jerk-offs to Little Nicky. It's sad to say, but my uncle looked down on his own father because he was a hard-working guy and not a gangster. He was never outwardly disrespectful to his father, but they weren't very close. My uncle's only ambition in life was to be a gangster, even from the time he was young. In the late 1940s and early 50s, Scarfo began his mob apprenticeship working as a bartender and a bookmaker at Piccolo's 500, where his schooling in the ways of La Cosa Nostra began under the direction of his uncles, the Buck brothers, while Nicholas Nicky Buck Piccolo was teaching his nephew about the ins and outs of mob business life, like how to be a bookmaker and run numbers. Felix Skinny Razor DeTulo, one of the mob's most feared hitmen, was teaching him how to be a killer. My uncle's first hit, he did it with Skinny Razor. There was a guy in South Philly who had a fruit stand. They called him the Huckster. The Huckster's brother had a problem with Skinny Razor, and Skinny Razor got the okay to kill him. So him and my uncle went to the guy's store in South Philadelphia. It was during a real bad snowstorm, and the guy let them into the store and they killed him. They stabbed him to death. When they were done, they cut his balls off and put them in the guy's mouth. That's how my uncle learned about killing, from being around Skinny Razor. Felix Skinny Razor DeTulo took an early liking to the young Scarfo, and Little Nicky was an eager student. Bonding in bloodlust, Skinny Razor taught Scarfo the art of the mob hit. It was a skill he would cherish, continue to hone, and eventually master. By 1954, at the age of 25, Nicodemo Little Nicky Scarfo had acquired the reputation in the underworld that he had sought. He was known as a mad dog killer, thanks in large part to the teachings of his mob mentor, Skinny Razor DeTulo. Scarfo was proposed for membership in La Cosa Nostra by Detulo and his uncle Nicholas, Nicky Buck Piccolo, and as a result was formally inducted into the mob by then Philadelphia mob boss Joseph Ida at an official making ceremony held at a restaurant and lounge named San Soel in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, just over the bridge from Center City, Philadelphia. Two of Scarfo's uncles, Tony and Mike Piccolo, the young brothers of Nicky Buck Piccolo, were also inducted into La Cosa Nostra at the same ceremony. Nicky Scarfo had achieved his dream. He was a bona fide wise guy, a made man. The blueberry farms in Hamilton were ancient history. He would never again be a working stiff, a civilian, a jerk off. Back then, it was almost unheard of to be made at such a young age in Philadelphia. My uncle was only 25. His uncles, Tony and Mike Buck, who were made at the same time, were twice his age. They were close to 50 at the time. Even then, Nicky Scarfo was on the fast track in La Cosa Nostra. Because he was with Skinny Razor, my uncle got to meet a lot of gangsters in northern Jersey and New York, and they respected him because Skinny Razor had a reputation of being a stone cold killer, and everyone knew it. He was both feared and respected on the streets, and my uncle looked up to him. He wanted to be just like him. In 1957, with Pascal out of the picture, Nancy and the 4-year-old Philip would leave Philadelphia and settle into the Scarfo family compound in Atlantic City, which at the time was more than a decade past its prime. Nancy would take a job in Atlantic City working for the Bureau of Children Services, which functioned like an adoption agency and provided care for underprivileged children. With his father out of the picture, Philip gravitated towards Nancy's older brother, Uncle Nick, as a father figure. At that time, it was just my mother, my grandparents, and myself living on Georgia Avenue. My father was gone. I was just a little boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old. My uncle was still living in South Philadelphia, but he used to come down a lot to see us or do business with Skinny Razor. In the 1950s and 60s, Felix Skinny Razor Detulo was a mob captain, a capo regime, and the Philadelphia mob's top guy at the Jersey Shore, and Nicky Scarfo was quickly becoming his #1 protege. When Philip was 7 years old, his great-grandfather, when Philip was 7 years old, his great-grandmother, Catherine Scarfo's mother, died, and the wake and funeral remain etched in Philip's memory more than 5 decades later. Back then, the Italian wakes lasted 3 days. I remember my grandmother and her brothers, the Piccolo brothers, Joe, Mike, and Nick, were standing next to the coffin, and all of these people were coming in to pay their respects. I was standing in the audience with my Uncle Nick, and walked a man with several guys around him. Everybody was going over to pay their respect to him and shake his hand or kiss him on the cheek. I remember this man looked very important, like the president. So I said to my uncle, "Who's that? Who's that guy?" And he said, "That's Angelo Bruno. He's the boss of the family." And even though I was only 7 years old, I understood what he was talking about. As I got older, I started spending more time with my uncle. He was like my father because my real father was gone. When we were alone, he would talk to me about what La Cosa Nostra was all about, how we were different from everyone else, and how we had certain rules that we had to follow. This is how I was raised from the time I was a little boy. Ironically, I was raised around the military like that, and it's the same kind of feeling that that's natural why I went into that. Carrying on, page 30. When Philip was 8 years old, his uncle Nick was given an order by his mentor Felix, Skinny Razor DeTulo, a wayward mob associate named Dominic Red Caruso, had disrespected Joseph Joe the Boss Rugnetti, the consigliere or counselor to the family's boss, Angelo Bruno, and Bruno had handpicked Skinny Razor's up-and-coming protege, Nicky Scarfo, to oversee Caruso's murder. Scarfo was happy to oblige and show Bruno and DeTulo that he was an able killer, a real gangster. To kill Red Caruso, Salvatore Chucky Merlino, one of the Scarfo's oldest friends, will go to Caruso's home in South Philadelphia and tell him that Scarfo wanted to see him, like a scene out of the very type of movie he loved so much as a young boy. Scarfo lulled Caruso into a state of relaxation, taking him to a bar in Vineland, New Jersey, that was owned by an associate of the Bruno crime family. Two more Bruno associates, Little Santo Romeo, and Anthony Casella, were inside the bar with Romeo working as a bartender. Shortly after arriving at the bar, Scarfo wasted little time in carrying out the hit. Little Nicky pulled out a handgun and shot Caruso 6 times at point-blank range, but Red's Caruso was still alive. My uncle told me the guy was lying there after he shot him, and he said, "You got me, Nick." And my uncle grabbed an ice pick from the bar and he stabbed him over and over again in the back until he died. He told me he stabbed him so hard that the ice pick got stuck in his back and part of it broke off when he tried to pull it out. But killing Caruso wasn't enough. The Sicilian-born Bruno had wanted him killed in a certain way to send a message. And while he wanted Scarfo to oversee the murder, he wanted another up-and-coming mobster to actually commit it. Ange had ordered that this Red Caruso be strangled to death, not shot, because he had talked fresh to Joe the Boss, and he wanted Santo Adone to strangle him and send a message that his mouth had gotten him killed. These Ziggies were big into sending messages, but what happened is Santo Adone was late getting to the bar, and by the time he got there, my uncle had already killed the guy. Now, when the boss says he wants a guy killed and he wants it done a certain way, that's the way it's got to be done. So when Santo got there, my uncle had him choke the corpse with some rope and leave marks around the neck. So just in case they found the body, Ange would know that he had been strangled like he ordered. Scarfo would also now have a lifelong ally in Santo Idone, who was born in Calabria, the same part of Italy where Scarfo's family came from. My uncle told me that Santo told him, "Thanks for covering for me, Nick. I won't forget it." And my uncle said, "You and me are Calabrese. We gotta stick together around all these ziggies." The hit team, led by Scarfo, would leave Caruso's dead body inside the bar as another team removed the body and moved it to another location, where a third team was supposed to dig a hole and bury the body, which was doused in lime to accelerate its decomposition. But what what they did was they got a fourth group to dig up the body and move it somewhere else, so that way the guys who did the killing and the guys who moved the body and the group that buried the body the first time had no idea where the body was, in case someone flipped and ratted them out. As Caruso's bullet-ridden corpse, still with part of an ice pick lodged in his back, lay buried in a makeshift grave somewhere in South Jersey, Scarfo still had work to do. Skinny Razor wanted my uncle to take the truck that had been used to transport the body back to Philadelphia so it could be destroyed, so no one could trace any evidence from the killing. My uncle decided to take me along because he thinks that he would look less suspicious driving this truck if he was with a little boy. I was 8 years old at the time. As we were driving, he told me that he had killed a very bad man the night before and he needed my help in getting rid of the truck, and they used to transport the body. Here I was, an 8-year-old kid, and these guys that I looked up to, they needed my help. I felt like I was doing what was right because my uncle said the man they killed was a very bad man and who had broken the rules. And when you break the rules, this is what happens. This was like what La Cosa Nostra was all about, the rules. I understood this from a very early age. My uncle was also talking about the rules and how you can't break the rules. I remember my uncle describing how he killed the guy, how he shot him and stabbed him with an ice pick, and what they typo and what the guy said to him. Looking back, I didn't think there was anything wrong with it. In Philip's young world, everyday life and organized crime were interchangeable. My uncle taught me about our life, the mob, the Cosa Nostra, from a very early age. It was natural, almost instinctive for me. I remember just knowing what it meant without someone having to spell it out all out for me. I understood what it was. All of the men I looked up to were of this world, so naturally I wanted to be a part of it too. When I was 10, my uncle taught me how to shoot. He used to take me hunting and we would shoot 22s. He said it was important for me to know how to use a gun in our life, even though I was this young. I taught my kids to shoot younger than that. So but I was in the army. So my uncle Nick also talked to me like I was an adult. He didn't treat me like I was 10 or 11. Everything he did, I wanted to do. I wanted to be just like him. In my mind, he was a man of honor and respect. Obviously, my uncle wasn't your average uncle. I mean, he wasn't out in the yard playing catch with me or coaching my little league baseball team. He was teaching me how to shoot guns and how to commit a murder and then how to successfully cover your tracks. That's the kind of stuff I grew up around, and it seemed completely normal to me. I felt like Marilyn on the old TV shows, The Munsters, the one human member of the family who lived amongst all of these strange characters, but I didn't think twice about it. It's scary to think how natural it all was. As Philip got ready for junior high school at St. Michael's in Atlantic City, his uncle had to deal with his first serious brush with the law. In May of 1963, my uncle and Chucky Merlino were in the Oregon Diner in South Philadelphia. My uncle gets into an argument with this longshoreman, this big Irish guy. And my uncle's little. He's only 5'5" and he weighs like 135 pounds. So he and the longshoreman get into an argument over a booth. And the guy grabs my uncle by the throat and starts choking him. As he's choking him, he pushes my uncle up against the counter. My uncle is getting ready to pass out, and he reaches on the counter behind him and grabs a butter knife and stabs the guy in the chest. The knife went right into his heart, and the guy died. My uncle used to love to tell this story and how he gutted this big Irish guy. The way he would tell the story, you'd think he was talking about hitting a home run to win the World Series. He would act it out. He'd take his hand and simulate what the guy had been done by putting his hand around his neck, showing how the guy choked. Or see again, they use it. That's a typo. They are using the word they instead of the. Guy had choked him. Then he'd show how he grabbed the knife and thrust it right into the guy's heart. Well, it was him or him. He was so proud of himself that he killed this guy who was bigger than him with a butter knife. Nicky Scarfo would plead guilty to manslaughter for the killing of William Dugan, the Irish guy in the diner. His sentence was a mere 23 months in prison. He was out in less than a year and would join the rest of his family in Atlantic City, leaving Philadelphia behind for now. Ducktown. In the mid-1960s, Ducktown was a small, close-knit Atlantic City neighborhood populated with prominent working-class Italian families with the names like Rondo, Fermaca, Digacianti, Matteo, Basile, Sacco, and Mancuso. And now it would be home to the Scarfos and Leonettis. Spanning a few short blocks, Ducktown covered the area of Texas, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, and Missouri avenues from Atlantic Avenue to Fairmont Avenue and to the Bay. The neighborhood was named Ducktown for the duck houses that were built along the bay front. Poultry and waterfowl were raised there and then slaughtered and later resold in the neighborhood markets. Ducktown was Atlantic City's Little Italy. Within 2 blocks of where we lived on Georgia Avenue, you had the White House, which is the best sub shop in the world. Everyone has been there. The Beatles, Muhammad Ali, Frank Sinatra, you name it. They've all eaten at the White House. You have Angelo's and Angeloni's, two of the city's best Italian restaurants, 2 blocks away. Before Angeloni's became Angeloni's, it was called the Madrid. There was a Doc's Oyster House right around the corner, which had the best seafood in Atlantic City. Barber's Fish Market and the city's top Italian bakeries, Rando's, Formacca's, and Panarelli's, were all a block or two away. I realize this too, not to interject, but I realize this too, how I'm a Canadian, and some of these Italian names and that are quite difficult to pronounce. I'm not Italian. There are there was a coffee shop called Tommy Howe's right next to Angelano's on Arctic Avenue. The older men used to go in there and play the number, and there was always a card game going. When I was a little boy, my grandfather used to take me down there when he would go. Joe DiMaggio used to go in there every time he was in Atlantic City, and I'd see him hanging out with the guys from the neighborhood, playing cards and drinking espresso. This was not even 50 yards from where I lived. On Missouri and Atlantic, you had Skinny D. Amato's 500 Club, which at the time was the biggest nightclub around. People would come from Philadelphia and New York to go there. The lines would be around the block every night. Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., they all used to perform there. Skinny was a friend of my uncle's, so we always got the best seats in the house. I remember this guy we used to call Blah Blah Buckets. He was older, and the neighborhood kids would tease him because he was slow. I think he worked at the 500 Club. He was nuts. He'd always be chasing someone up the street, cursing and threatening to kill them. He was out there every day, and the kids were never stopped breaking his balls. Like clockwork, if you stayed on the street long enough, you'd see a group of kids running and blah blah chasing after them, threatening to kill them. I had a lot of fun growing up there. This was my home. Philip's weekly regimen at that time included waking up at 6:30 a.m. on Fridays and walking a block and a half to Barber's Fish Market on Mississippi Avenue, where he would pick up fresh fish and then deliver it to the nuns who worked at and lived at St. Michael's, the neighborhood Catholic church, and the namesake of the adjacent school that Philip attended. The back of the school was directly across the street from the Scarfo compound. Everyone in the neighborhood went to St. Mike's. I went to Mass every morning before school, and I go on Sundays with my grandmother. After my uncle got out of jail for killing the guy in the Oregon diner, he left South Philadelphia and he moved in with us on Georgia Avenue. Living there at the time were my grandparents, my mother, myself, my uncle, and his wife, Mimi. And right around this time, Nicky Jr. was born. Things were quiet for a while, and a couple of years later, I was getting ready for high school. Upon graduation from St. Michael's, Philip would move on to Holy Spirit High School, located in Absecon. New Jersey, less than 10 miles from Scarfo, the Scarfo family home in Ducktown. I was on the baseball team at Holy Spirit with a lot of kids from the neighborhood, and we were a very good team. My uncle used to come to games and sit in the bleachers, and he would take bets on the games right there in the gymnasium. There was even this guy named Hoffman who used to write the betting lines on our games to the local paper. When our team played, it was a very big deal. A fellow Ducktown resident and Holy Spirit teammate named Chris Ford would eventually go on to Villanova University and then the NBA, where he played for both the Detroit Pistons and the Boston Celtics. After retiring as a player, Ford coached NBA teams in Boston, Milwaukee, Los Angeles, and Philadelphia. Chris Ford was a big deal to all of the kids in Ducktown, because he was such an amazing athlete, and he was one of us. He grew up right there on Missouri Avenue on top of Capone's Bar. His brother Harry eventually moved into one of the apartments in our building, and would always tell us what was coming around when we weren't there. He stood all day on the porch above our office, which was on the ground floor of 28 North Georgia Avenue, smoking a cigarette, just watching what was going on in the neighborhood, who was coming, who was going. He'd also help my mother and grandmother if me or my uncle weren't around. My uncle would always have me give him a few bucks. Well, Ducktown may have been energetic and thriving in the mid to late 60s. The rest of Atlantic City was desolate and 20 years past its prime as the world's playground. Nicky Scarfo was surviving on traditional mob rackets like bookmaking, extortion, and loan sharking to make ends meet. Skinny Razor died in 1966, so my uncle became the top mob guy in Atlantic City. He basically inherited what Skinny Razor had, and Ange had gave him the okay to run it how he saw fit. For the most part, he was the only game in town. He was making book and writing small loans, but he was struggling as there wasn't a whole lot going on down there at the time. Him and a friend of his named Tommy Butch opened a place called the Penguin Club, and he was also involved in a couple of dirty bookstores with this guy named Alvin Feldman, who called himself the King of the Jews. He wasn't making a lot of money, but to him at the time, the money wasn't important. He would always say, the money will come, but this thing is about respect and honor. It's not about money. He was making a name for himself within the Bruno organization, and that's what mattered the most to him, his reputation. While the nuns at Holy Spirit were teaching Philip the basic curriculum of English, algebra, and history, his uncle Nick continued to educate him in the ways of the mob. He was constantly talking to me about the Cosa Nostra. It was all the time. He told me, in this life, you never rat. You keep your mouth shut and you mind your own business, he told me. We don't ever discuss our business with women, and we don't discuss our life with outsiders. You don't tell nobody nothing. It's just me and you talking, he would say. If you want to get involved with me in this thing just because I'm your uncle, I can't help you. He told me I had to do things on my own and be my own man. At this point, I was ready. I wanted to be like him. I wanted to follow in his footsteps. With his uncle ready to begin his second stretch in jail, Philip would have his chance to do just that. Okay, another 10 minutes. I'm just going to carry on with the next chapter on page 38 entitled Yardville. Yardville. In 1971, as Philip was graduating from high school, Nicky Scarfo was called to testify before the New Jersey State Commission of Investigation, SCI, that was investigating the infiltration of organized crime into various labor unions. After refusing to answer any questions, including his name, Scarfo was charged with contempt and sentenced to an indefinite prison term. He was sent to Yardville State Prison just outside of Trenton, New Jersey, with several other powerful mobsters, including the boss of Philadelphia mob, Angelo Bruno. Scarfo could have been released at any time had he honored the subpoena and testified before the SCI, but instead he followed the same rule that he had taught his nephew Philip and refused to testify. Scarfo would spend the next 2 years behind bars. Already a proven killer, it was now known that little Nicky could keep his mouth shut. Besides Scarfo and Bruno, was longtime New York mob leader Jerry Catena, Trenton mob captain Nicky Russo, North Jersey mobster Rick Blackie Napoli, and Genovese crime family capos Anthony Little Pussy Russo, Joseph Bayonne, Joe Ziccarelli, and Joe Johnny Coca-Cola Lardiere, and an upcoming Genovese soldier named Louis Bobby Manna. Like Scarfo and Bruno, the others were also jailed for refusing to testify before the State Commission of Investigation. Organized crime investigators and members of the press dubbed them the Yardville Nine. For Scarfo, the 2-year prison sentence did wonders for his career. Not only did he get valuable face time with Philadelphia mob boss Angelo Bruno, but he also got close to men deeply entrenched in mob operations in North Jersey and New York, and forged bonds that he would exploit to his advantage in the years to come. For Philip Leonetti, his uncle's prison term would help jumpstart his career in the underworld, as he stated as an emissary for both his uncle and for Bruno, and inaugurated himself with the mob heavyweights from New York, whom Philip would interact with when visiting his uncle. When my uncle was in Yardville, it allowed him to get closer to Angelo Bruno, which was a good thing. Back then, my uncle had a lot of respect for Ange, and Ange respected my uncle because he knew my uncle was a killer, a gangster, and that my uncle was 100% committed to the Cosa Nostra. Once a week, I used to drive my grandmother to see my uncle, and I would take Ange's wife to see him. On the way back, I would take them both out to lunch. Before long, my uncle and Ange had me taking messages back to their guys on the street in South Philly and Atlantic City. Guys like Phil Testa and Chucky Merlino. At the end of each visit, me, my uncle, and Ange would huddle in a corner and they would tell me who to see and what to say. I did exactly what they told me. I was still a teenager, 18, 19 years old. My uncle also started getting real close to guys like Jerry Katina, Nick Russo, Blackie Napoli, and Bobby Manna. Gerardo Jerry Katina was a powerful captain in the Genovese crime family and had been a prominent underworld figure for more than 50 years after joining forces with Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky in the 1920s during the legendary Castellamarez War. Katina was the influential boss of the Genovese family's operations in northern New Jersey and was one of four men who ran the family via a structured ruling panel following the imprisonment of family namesake Vito Genovese in 1959. Raphael Ralph Napoli, known as Blackie, was a mob soldier associate with the Philadelphia mob's North Jersey operation based out of Down Neck section of New York. Napoli's capo and direct superior was the powerful and treacherous Sicilian-born Tony Bananas Caponegro, who would become Angelo Bruno's consigliere and the boss of the family's North Jersey crew. Louis Bobby Manna was a rising star in the Genovese family and was a trusted member of the notorious Vincent the Chin Gigante's Greenwich Village crew. I'm just going to finish this last page, and that'll be my hour. My uncle and Bobby Manna became extremely close when they were in Yardville. They were the same age and spent a lot of time together. They would walk the track together and talk about their future plans. They were both considered up-and-comers in the mob, and they were both very committed to La Cosa Nostra. My uncle used to tell me, Bobby is gonna be big one day, you watch. He would tap his index finger to his head and say, Bobby has this, meaning he had brains, that he was intelligent. My uncle would always say, in La Cosa Nostra, in this thing, you need this. And he would tap his index finger to his head. And you need this. And he would shape his finger like a gun and point it to the ground. A few years late, after Scarfo and Manna were released from Yardville, Nicky Scarfo's prediction came true about Bobby Manna when Manna's close friend Vincent the Chin Gigante became the boss of the Genovese family and would eventually become the most powerful mob leader in the United States during the 1980s, and immediately named the intelligent Bobby Manna his consigliere, or third in command. There's the dust in here from the wood stove. The relationship Nicky Scarfo cultivated with Bobby Manna during their walk talks at Yardville, would benefit little Nicky and, by extension, Philip, and play a profound role in shaping the Philadelphia Atlantic City in the years and decades to come. Philip had graduated from high school and was now becoming immersed in his uncle's secret world, La Cosa Nostra. During the time my uncle was in Yardville, I flew down to Florida to see my father. I hadn't seen him since he left me and my mother when I was a little boy. He had an Italian restaurant in Orlando area called Leonetti's. We spent a few days together, but that was basically the extent of my relationship with him. He died a few years later, and that was it. From that point on, I was with my uncle every day. College was out. Life in La Cosa Nostra was in. Well, that's an hour right there. Um, really interesting book. Really enjoying that. Uh, I know how they mentioned in the beginning of the book how they do have a different typeset for Phil and for Nicky, which is kind of cool because we've all seen that or listened to that story, or maybe you haven't, but there's a professional one out there that people have done. So I can kind of hear the voice in my head, if you know what I mean. And so I'm on page 40 here now, and I'll be summing her up today on this one. But where did I put my bookmark now? All right, and I'm gonna continue on actually with Sammy the Bull's book there in a little bit, maybe in a bit here today. I've really been enjoying reading these, so I hope you've been enjoying listening to me read them. And I'll see you in the next video. I'm reading 5 by 5. I'm out.